Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm your curly-haired host David, and today let's talk about whether or not Australia should stay a constitutional monarchy, or are we better off as a republic? What are the pros and cons? Welcome to my two-part interview series discussing that very thing. This episode is the pro-republic interview, where I sat down via Zoom with the co-chair of the Australian Republic movement to ask why, in her view, Australia should become a republic. Naturally, I encourage you to understand both sides of an argument, so I also have an interview with a member of the Australian Monarchist League, where he provides a different perspective and opinion. I highly recommend checking that episode out after this one, if you haven't already, so you can critically examine and contrast the two ideas. A link to the other interview, as well as the websites for both the Australian Monarchist League and Australian Republic movement, are linked below in the description, so you can learn more about both movements. As I've been told, a quick intro is a good intro, so let's get into it, yo. Let's jump right on in and hear the pro-republic arguments. Let's transition into our interview with today's guest introducing herself and, of course, giving a brief physical description for accessibility purposes.
Hello, my name's Esther Anatolitis, and with Nathan Hansford, I am co-chair of the Australian Republic movement. I am a woman wearing glasses, I have short dark hair, and I am wearing a blue jacket and a white t-shirt.
Let's expand on what the Australian Republic movement is. What does it do?
Well, the Australian Republic movement is that strong and nationally connected, membership-based organisation that moves Australia towards becoming a republic. So it's about education, it's about connecting us and reminding us, I guess, of the reasons why a monarchy doesn't make sense in contemporary Australia.
We are currently in a constitutional monarchy, so King Charles III, as of recording, is our head of state. When he passes away, automatically it'll be Prince William, then King William. So I feel like a lot of Australians at least kind of understand that as a concept, even if they don't know the intricacies of that. Whereas a republic, well, we're probably a little bit less familiar with that. So could you please give us a brief outline of what a republic means and what it involves, and then also why are some reasons that Australia should become a republic?
Well, an Australian Republic simply means that our head of state, the sort of head of our government, is an Australian citizen who was elected on merit by Australian people. And it's interesting, we kind of assume that most Australians know that Charles is our head of state, that he inherited that role as birthright, and that when he dies, he'll be succeeded by a member of his family. The Australian Republic movement has research that shows that 30 up to 40% in some age groups actually don't realise that Charles is Australia's head of state. There's great awareness of what the royal family is, what they mean in England, in Great Britain. When they come and visit, there's a sense of, these people who we see on TV or we've heard of, what a royal family is. But there actually isn't as great an understanding as we think that actually at the apex of Australia's government sits this king from another time and another place. In contemporary Australia, when we think about the democratic institutions that we're really proud of and that are unique all over the world, for example, having an electoral commission that is independent, having compulsory voting so that everyone not only takes a strong interest in democracy, but also so that all parties have to develop policies for all of us. These are actually unique things. Australia leads in many, many ways. Preferential voting, these are actually Australian innovations. But of course, we're not entirely, fully a democracy until the person who is our head of state is democratically elected.
I had a very interesting conversation with Alexander Volz yesterday from the Australian Monarchist League. He started off saying that, if you're making a claim, you need to be able to back that up with evidence and put the sort of burden of proof on Republicans, because according to him, a constitutional monarchy has stood the test of time. We still have a constitutional monarchy after hundreds of years. Other countries do as well. Whereas a republic, well, we haven't had that for hundreds of years, so how can we know that it is a good and stable idea? In his words, anything a republic can do, a constitutional monarchy can do better. How do you respond to that?
I know, it's such a funny one, isn't it? And it's so antithetical to who Australians are. I mean, really, that argument right there is a great argument for an Australian republic. Australia today is a diverse, multicultural people who've come from many, many parts of the world. And one of the things that attracted people here was the strength and the integrity of democracy. Certainly for historic reasons, given the circumstances and the violent circumstances in which Australia was colonised, there was a period where having a head of state from that foreign country was appropriate. But of course, we grow and mature. King Charles himself has said that a future Australian republic is a matter for the Australian people, just as it is for, the many, many Commonwealth countries who are now republics. And in fact, leaving the Commonwealth need not be part of our future. We can stay part of the Commonwealth and be an Australian republic. And this argument that we've got this tradition, we've been a constitutional monarchy here, therefore we should stick with tradition. Well, the tradition on this continent is tens of thousands of years, 60,000, 80,000 years of hundreds of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander First Nations living and working in a culture of very complementary and respectful democratic and kinship structures. Those 60 to 80,000 or more years of tradition have, of course, also experienced the last couple of hundred years of constitutional monarchy. It is the evolution and progress of the Australian culture that we will become a republic. It's simply a matter of when, and the when is about when it is something that so engages, a passionate majority of Australians that our elected politicians will follow the will of the people and create the structures and in the future the referendum that makes that possible. We already know that the overwhelming majority of Australians support an Australian republic. There's a small portion of, really kind of passionately committed Australian monarchists. We also know, again, from the Australian Republic movement's research and relationships with parliamentarians, that 75% of currently sitting Australian parliamentarians support an Australian republic. So it's simply, for the Australian Republic movement about growing and strengthening our movement to find that moment for all of Australia.
Speaking of traditions, as you mentioned, Indigenous people have had traditions for tens of thousands of years in Australia. The idea of constitutional monarchy was actually introduced to them via violence. But in some pro-monarchist arguments, they do point out that not all republics are stable. France got a republic through violence. The USA is not exactly a very stable place. Russia and China are more authoritarian. From a monarchist perspective, the idea that a constitutional monarchy is rooted in stability because it has stood the test of time, whereas republics sometimes have not stood the test of time and may destabilize a country and may lead to or be created through violence.
Yeah, so much of that is just, absolute scaremongering. They're just not particularly sound arguments, and they really conflict and contrast with who the Australian people are today. I've heard that argument many times. So if we switch to a republic, there'll be this violence, instability. And as you say, where we are in Australia today, the constitutional monarchy is founded on violence, the violent dispossession of First Nations who had been living alongside one another, since time immemorial. There are, of course, many countries in the world that have political stability and have never had a king from another continent imposed upon them. I think those kinds of arguments, the fundamental thing really is that they overlook who people are, who Australians are today, and what the foundation has been for the relative stability that Australia has known. We can have an Australian head of state without making radical and unsettling changes to the way that the Australian government, the Australian Parliament works. The other thing to add, of course, is that the stability that we've known across this period, and it's important to say that, when we talk about stability, that tends to be the experience of people of privilege, not the experience of people of colour, of poorer people. That is a particular cultured experience, this notion of stability. But that stability comes from a whole range of institutions that Australians have created. Again, that includes the Electoral Commission, it includes things like our public cultural institutions, universities, libraries, museums, schools, town halls, civic institutions, the media, all the ways that we meet with each other, interact with each other, and practice our culture in all the complex and diverse ways that we do. There isn't one way of being Australian. And so when we elect people to represent us in Parliament, we elect, quite a diverse range of people. As I was saying earlier, the Australian Republic movement has research that shows that, 30% and maybe up to 40% in some age groups actually don't realise that Charles is our head of state. Now, that's to do with poor civics education, but it's also a pretty profound indicator of the irrelevance of that to contemporary Australia. We can absolutely have an Australian as head of state and be confident in the complex, generous Australian culture that we have to continue to progress and evolve in all the ways that we do every day.
Harking back to some monarchist arguments, the economy is an issue that affects us all, and one of the arguments is that, well, constitutional monarchies have good economies. There is an argument that, well, our system of government clearly must have some sort of influence on that, and as we are a constitutional monarchy, surely there is some benefit to that and correlation.
This is just one of those, silly distraction arguments. Some of the biggest economies in the world, and some of the strongest, have never been constitutional monarchies. I'd love to be presented one day, with an actual argument for why Australia should remain a constitutional monarchy, because it's, so many silly distractions. I do understand that people want to cling to cultural tropes that they enjoy. But again, they're just so irrelevant to contemporary Australia. And we go back to the period where the Australian Constitution was written. Decades after the gold rush, there was a period, in Australian history where we had become very wealthy thanks to that gold and a range of other innovations. Melbourne, where I am today, here on the lands of the Boonwurrung, the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, there was a time where Melbourne was the richest city in the entire Commonwealth because of that. So there came a time where those comforts, those riches, particularly in this state, in Victoria, settlers were building galleries, museums, town halls, civic centres all over the state, to really, express Australian culture in new ways. And because of the comfort and the wealth, the privilege that was emerging, it was possible for some people to come together and say, we should think about federating the different states of this continent. And we should have a lot of conversations with people and think about what's the best constitution, what's the best way to write down how we're going to make decisions together as a new federation. But who were the people having those conversations? They were, of course, wealthy pastoralists, landowners. They were the people who were already privileged, who had the time and the education, had the networks, already knew each other, to sit down together and write that document. The Australian Constitution isn't something that exists in a hallowed place for, all time. Like any written document, it was written by particular people at a particular time and was the result of, that historic context. The Constitution was also written in order to be amended. It gives us, great detailed instruction on how to update it in the future. This notion that we're going to become less economically stable, we're going to become less culturally stable, etc., they're all just distractions and furphies. What we've built up over time is a country of strong civic and cultural and democratic institutions where we're so comfortable with the notion of how our democracy works. The natural next step is to make sure that there is an Australian as head of state. And I'll say one other thing about the Constitution. There's a lot in there that doesn't quite make sense. It's really worth a good read. And you think, oh yeah, I can understand why they popped that clause in back then. There's one particular clause, Section 44 of the Constitution, that says that people who hold allegiance to foreign powers are not eligible to stand for election to the federal parliament. And that has been taken in recent years, as we've seen, through a range of destabilising developments for the Australian Parliament, where many MPs had to stand down, because the way that part of the Constitution has been interpreted is to say that if you hold Australian citizenship and nationality or citizenship of another country, then you're not eligible to be an Australian politician. So, I'm an Australian citizen. I also have Greek citizenship by birthright. I am not eligible to be an Australian federal parliamentarian. But our head of state is not an Australian citizen. He is, of course, not the citizen of any country. He is a king, and he inherits that role by birthright. So we have this very strange double standard where only Australian citizens, not dual or other citizens, can be parliamentarians, but the head of state is not Australian, is not dedicated to us full time, was not elected by us, does not represent us. And MPs are asked when they are sworn in to swear allegiance to a king from another country and not to the Australian people. It just doesn't make any sense.
I do just want to mention another element of the Constitution. Section 59, disallowance by the Queen and heirs and successors, naturally, does mean that there is a constitutionally entrenched power of the monarch to simply disallow a law, just undo it up to 1 year after it has been given royal assent by the Governor-General. There is no provision there for when this could apply or any form of restriction. It's kind of like the appendix of the Constitution, if you think about it. It doesn't really serve a purpose because the king's never going to exercise that power. But it's just there, just to sort of as a real sort of evidence of the context in which it was written was, we are a British colony effectively, getting a little bit more autonomy, but we don't want to have so much autonomy as to be completely outside the control and influence of the monarch's power and prerogative. I mean, that being said, I don't want that to be like a fear-mongering thing, because as we know, that's never going to be exercised by constitutional convention, but it just gives a sort of context to the idea behind framing it.
I think that's a really important point, though. Why is anything in the Constitution if we hope and imagine that it would never be exercised? We never imagined that in 1975 a Governor-General would dismiss an Australian government without going through the proper process. There's a whole lot in the Constitution that makes no sense, but it does make sense from the point of view of a king, of a foreign monarch, that if you're going to have this document drawn up where you're the head of state, you actually expect to have some powers. And there's a lot of strange things about the Constitution. One of them, of course, is that the Prime Minister is not mentioned in the Constitution. One of the arguments that's often given by monarchists is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, we've got a document that doesn't describe the way that politics actually plays out today, doesn't describe the conventions that are followed in the Parliament, has as its head, again, a person from, some other place who is not connected and not relevant to our structure today. There's plenty that's wrong with that. If we were going to design an Australian constitution today, would we choose somebody else from some other country to be the head of it? And if you were setting up an organisation, a company, a club, a community, a township, a state, a nation, and you wanted to work out how to make decisions together, surely you would want your constituting document and the apex of that democracy to be absolutely clearly to the letter the way that the culture and the decision making works. There's absolutely no way you'd throw into that constitution a whole lot of little dodgy practices and potential poison pills and so on that not only make no sense, but are recipes for disaster. You'd be a lot more careful, and certainly today you would be developing a model and an approach that genuinely involves all Australians in all of our diversity.
You've talked a bit about your ideas of what the shortcomings of a constitutional monarchy are, but if we are to change to become a republic, we need a referendum, and the public needs to actually agree and care about that change to be motivated enough to vote for it. So let's unpack what the change would or would not be like. When people bring up the idea of a republic, well, the most obvious example that we have is the US, because, of our cultural economic ties to them. A lot of media we get is from the US, so that is the prime example of a republic. And I get people in my comments being like, oh, I don't want insert US president here to, be the role model for an Australian republic. Would we be in any way like the US?
Goodness, no, because we don't have a culture that's like that. Culture doesn't transform overnight, and the models that would be developed would, of course, be of the Australian people. There is a model called the Australian Choice Model that has been developed by the Australian Republic movement as the result of rigorous research and forums and so on over many years. And that's about making really just minimal changes and looking at how a head of state would be appointed. At the moment, one of the arguments that is given against making the inevitable and positive change to an Australian republic is that it would really politicise the role of that head of state. Well, at the moment, the Governor-General is simply appointed by the Prime Minister of the day. There's literally no other process. That's rather odd. And it really falls to, obviously the Prime Minister realises that they have to make a responsible decision that is going to be widely accepted. We've had a recent Governor General who did have to leave that post earlier than the 5 years. Someone who had been implicated in some very poor practices of the church that he was a part of. We've had Governors General who, one of whom quite notoriously completely overstepped his role and was engaging in direct communications and correspondence and then action without the knowledge and consent of the Prime Minister, whereas it's very clear in the Constitution that the Governor-General acts on the advice of the government of the day. At the moment, our Governor-General is Samantha Mostyn, who is an exceptional woman and an absolutely great leader who I've known a range of different capacities over for well over a decade. She's been the chair of arts organisations, as well as, of course, being on the boards of, big impactful organisations, was the former chair of our ethics committee at the National Gallery of Australia, whose board I serve. I'm very much hoping that she'll be Australia's last Governor-General. But of course, at the moment, as I say, that person is simply appointed by Australia's Prime Minister. We do need a process that's, quite straightforward, where Australians have a say to make that, as richly democratic as our other public roles in Australian public life. We need not look to presidential style models. It will simply be a natural evolution of the Australian public culture that we now know and appreciate every day.
In my conversation with the Australian Monarchist League, Alexander pointed out, his argument was that the idea that if we were to appoint a president based off merit, well, that simply is not the most believable thing because, jobs for the boys and that sort of thing. If we hark back to the 1999 referendum, it was don't vote for the politicians' republic. I think actually if you look on the Australians for Constitutional Monarchy website as well, and maybe Australian Monarchist League, that's still that line of like the politicians' republic. This will give politicians more power, and the president will inherently be another politician. The counter idea is, the monarch is apolitical. The crown cannot have a political agenda because the crown is the abstract concept of sovereignty of the nation, embodied by the sovereign of the day, who then acts impartially to appoint the Governor-General, who then acts impartially to give authority to the decisions of elected members of Parliament that are accountable to the people. So what is your response to the idea that we would be adjusting the system to create more politicians and give more political power to politicians?
There's nothing more politicised than appointing a head of state where the process is that one person appoints them. The appointment of the Governor-General is the Prime Minister's choice. As we say, there have been some problematic Governors-General in the past. It shouldn't simply be a matter of luck. At the moment, it is doubly a matter of luck. We have to kind of cross our fingers that the Prime Minister of the day is going to appoint, a good and upright person. And we've got to cross our fingers that once the current monarch dies and, is succeeded by their child, we've also got to cross our fingers that they're going to be a good person. One of the arguments that's often given around, moving towards an Australian Republic is, oh my goodness, the royal family, haven't they had some scandals? Probably best we don't go into all of that. I'm often asked that, do you want to comment on this family member and that family member? And my response is always, look, all families are complex. I've got some family members who, I tend not to have some conversations with, or, we're going to get into an argument. But my family is not the Australian head of state. When we look at someone in a position of authority, we think about, politicians and their families, and expecting the media to be fair and respectful in giving them their privacy, and that is as it should be. They've been elected, they're doing a job for us. For a monarchy, for anyone in a royal family, their entire existence, their entire reason for being is to carry out that head of state role, and therefore it is entirely within the scope of our observation, criticism, to look at who their family is. And so when we think about, the potential instability of that, and there certainly has been a great deal of instability in the long history of that monarchy over the 1,000 years, and some very interesting people who have, acceded to the throne, there should be no aspect of Australian democracy that is simply left to chance, that's just luck, that's just us crossing our fingers thinking, I really hope that the next king is going to be a good person. I really hope that the next Governor-General is going to be a good person. I think we can do a lot better than that, and make sure that they are democratically selected on merit. That is the way that we would expect any other public institution to operate, and certainly that's the way that our democracy should operate.
When it comes to change, there is always an element of uncertainty about what that change could do, and when it comes to changing our constitution, there's a few references, there's more than just a few, to the monarchy. It is actually pretty integral to it. So the No campaign in 1999, for example, said that only 13 sections had ever successfully been amended in over 100 years at this point, whereas to become a republic we would have to have 69 changes in one go to our constitution. To quote, each of these 69 changes are untried and untested. How would you respond to that claim?
It's scaremongering, there's no end to scary, numbers-focused, distracting arguments. And I remember back in 1999, all the scaremongering that was put. The history of referendums in Australia shows that they tend to only pass when all sides of politics support them. And so it's really about that strong majority of Australians who support an Australian Republic making intentions and expectations known and clear to the people who represent us, no matter which side of politics they're from, so that we can, as a nation, make this important progress together. It's unfortunately very easy to scare and confuse people in a situation where many Australians just don't know about the nature of the Constitution, what's in it. We haven't got a strong culture of civics education in Australia as the Australian Republic movement, but also just as, everyday people. We do need to find ourselves in more and more of these conversations where we are talking about what we expect of governments. Even Rupert Murdoch, who heads up one of the most conservative media empires in the world, was saying just a few weeks ago that he expects that Australia will become a republic within the coming decade. The only thing that is preventing it is that, there are still some Australians who, I guess, are just less comfortable with the growing, changing diversity of Australia, and they feel more comfortable and more sort of safe and secure when some of the institutions that, make them feel kind of happy and safe, like a British king, that makes them more comfortable than understanding and engaging with the reality of the complex diversity that Australia is. It really is that simple. An Australian head of state is a democratic and cultural inevitability for Australia. And when it's very clear to the people who we've elected to represent us that is the wish and the expectation of the Australian people, then it will happen.
For this to happen, people actually need to care about it enough for it to happen. However, right, there is no current model for a republic. The Australian Republic movement has an idea, a proposed model that you use as a conversation starter, but the government does not have a model. Eventually, in the future, when we do have a republic referendum, there will be a rigorous process, there always is, in determining what to put forward for constitutional change. Like, in the 90s, there was a constitutional convention where monarchists attended to have their say as well. We can expect in the future to understand what a proposed republic would look like for Australia. In the meantime, there is only a certain amount of things that we could say. Does that not really just limit the conversation?
It's a great question, and it really starts with those really simple questions. I mean, do you think that Australia is part of a kingdom? Do you realise that Charles is our head of state? Do you really think that contemporary Australia should have a king? Do you really think that Australians want and expect and imagine someone in, a privileged palatial life on the other side of the world should inherit by birthright that role of head of state of Australia? And of course, as soon as you open that conversation, the answer 99% of the time is, well, of course not. None of that makes any sense whatsoever. I mean, they did make it look very glamorous on The Crown, but history and entertainment and gossip magazines and so on are not a basis for a contemporary Australian democracy. So there's the threshold question of, wait a minute, do you realise, and, does this make any sense to you? And then once we're having a conversation about who the head of state is and that it should be someone that's Australian, then we get to the question of, okay, well, what should the model be? And this is, a conversation for everyone to have. When it comes to the conversation around the model, we need to be in a place where there's some really great facilitated conversations are happening, but people are really honestly participating in good faith and not to kind of, play some very lazy political game.
One thing that always gets brought up for any kind of political action or change is cost. I've looked up some estimates of what the cost could be to become a republic. No one agrees, is the short answer. The answer is it costs an amount of money, obviously. What is your response to the idea, well, it would be costly to transition to a republic? It's not just costly to hold a referendum, but then also, the changing of things required. Logos, branding, institutions would have to change their names. Surely there is a cost associated with that. So is a republic worth however amount of money it'll cost to change to be a republic? And do we have an idea of what that cost could be?
Oh, look, for all the reasons you've just described, it's, it would be impossible because, of course, there's the cost to government, there's the costs, more broadly with those institutions and so on. We're about to discover with the visit of Charles and Camilla in October just how much it costs the Australian public when a member of the royal family or a sitting monarch visits Australia, because, of course, it is Australians who foot that bill. Again, it exposes the incongruity of having a head of state who's part-time time, lives somewhere else, has got this other job that obviously occupies the vast majority of his time. His everyday allegiance is, of course, to the people where he lives. The, ultimate, once we are a republic with an Australian head of state, of course, would be saving the money that we would be spending on things like that, like those visits, because the head of state does have to pop into, the different sort of outposts of former empire or current empire every now and again. But of course, we agree to and we create change all the time, and we invest in that change for the benefit of all Australians. So I think, any number that we might hear bandied about of what that cost is simply, not something that we can know. It's something that, of course, is an essential and a really important investment in the way that we create Australia's future.
A referendum costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and, well, a royal visit costs, 1 million, 2 million, maybe 3 if we find out what the security and GST costs are. Yes, there is a cost to royal visits, but if also we just didn't hold a referendum, we could fund those royal visits, we could fund scores of them. How do we balance that?
We're going to say referendums are expensive. The subsequent argument is let's strip back the Electoral Commission and the integrity of the way that we conduct our democracy. Nobody wants that. The costs of something like a referendum, again, they're investments in our future. The reason that it's costly in Australia to put on elections is because we have the most robust and transparent electoral commission in the world. And that is an Australian innovation. It has nothing to do with being a constitutional monarchy. It's one of the great Australian inventions. So, the electoral commission, preferential voting, universal voting, secret voting, all the things that strengthen our democracy. That's always worth investing in. Referendums build not just who we are as a people, but they open up some important public conversations. A royal visit is an expense that might kind of add some tourism in some places, but does not contribute to the ways that we build and create Australia's future together. There's already been a town in regional New South Wales who, when they heard that Charles and Camilla would be going to Sydney and to Canberra, and somewhere in regional New South Wales, one town, their local council voted to say, look, we wouldn't be rolling out the welcome mat. You wouldn't be welcome to come and visit our town because we simply can't afford the expense. I mean, I think it's actually ludicrous and deeply shameful that when the royal family visit, they expect anybody else to pick up the tab. It's an absolute affront. Again, it's another example of that kind of unchecked, unquestioned privilege. And yeah, we don't know what those costs are. It probably isn't 1 million or 2 million. It's probably a lot more than that. Yeah, again, those arguments where there's an attempt to sort of quantify something and say this number against that number, they're just distractions.
Of course, becoming a republic involves a few changes, but a lot of things will still also remain the same. So, rapid fire. Will we still have a prime minister if we become a republic, yes or no?
Yes, we will.
Will our flag change?
Only if people wanted to, but that's got nothing to do with us becoming a republic. So in the immediate, no.
What about our national anthem? Will that change?
Oh, again, only if people wanted to, but again, that's got nothing to do with becoming a republic. So in the immediate, no.
We can change our national anthem and we can change our flag through a public vote, regardless of whether or not we become a republic. And in fact, Fiji, for example, became a republic in the 80s. They still have the Union Jack, a reference to Great Britain. In fact, they still had the Queen's birthday as a holiday, I believe, which also brings up, how will it affect our public holidays? That's also another thing that gets brought up.
Oh, yeah, well, good luck trying to take public holidays away from people. It would simply evolve into, a different day of recognition.
Just to close us out, I want to know what your final statements are and how we can learn more about an Australian republic.
The overwhelming majority of Australians support Australia becoming a republic. That's not just Australian Republic movement research. It's every poll that's been done for decades, this year, last year, previously. So the best way to make that happen is to be a joiner, to join the Australian Republic movement so that we're able to get together, and have the conversations and make the plans that make this a reality. We have members, many thousands of members all over Australia, from all cultures, ages, all, sides of politics. This isn't only a conservative issue, and this isn't only a progressive issue. It's something that Australians everywhere feel passionately about. The quicker we strengthen our movement, the sooner we will find our moment and become an Australian republic.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today about the idea of a republic for Australia. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
And there you have it. Thank you very much to Esther for her time and perspective. Again, if you haven't checked out the interview I did with Alexander from the Australian Monarchist League, please do so now to compare and contrast. Again, the websites for both the Australian Republic Movement and Australian Monarchist League are linked in the description, so you can learn more about their respective movements and, hey, even get involved in one of them if it takes your fancy. Why not? Comment down below your favourite thing about the interview, be respectful in the comments, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. As always, a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon who give me money but also the emotional support I need during the hours of editing. Both these interviews were super long. I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.